Hello, everybody. I am here with my friend Elizabeth Bechard, and today I just thought it would be fun to talk about her new book, Parenting in a Changing Climate. And Elizabeth's a friend of mine. She's one of those online friends turned in real life friends. We spend a lot of time on Marco Polo, talking about all sorts of things, a lot of parenting. And I've had the privilege of being sort of getting a backseat view of her book writing process. And I've had a chance to be an early reader on the book. It's an excellent book, a book I think all parents should read. And so I will read her professional bio in a minute. And then after that, we're just going to dive into a conversation about the book and about why you might like to read the book. So Elizabeth is an integrative health coach with a decade of experience in coordinating and implementing research studies exploring human resilience, wellness, and behavior change. A graduate of Yale's Climate Change and Health Certificate Program, she has taught in the health coaching program at Duke Integrative Medicine and is a certified expressive writing facilitator. Bechard lives with her husband and young twins in her native Durham, North Carolina. All right. Elizabeth, I'm really glad that we get to do this. It's a different way for us to interact.
Yeah.
But I really do love the book, and I'm really excited that you've written it and that it's out in the world. I think that climate change, the climate crisis, is on everyone's mind right now. There have been a lot of really terrifying headlines, and I think a lot of us are having the personal experience of climate-driven natural disaster. I know we had that this summer. There was a wildfire very close to our house, and it was the first time that I was so personally impacted. So I guess I'll just start by asking sort of what's your story of waking up to the climate crisis? What's your story of parenting, and how the two combine for you? What brought you to write this book? It's a lot of questions.
Yeah, I think it probably needs a lot of questions because there's so many different things are at play for me, and sort of getting to this point of really waking up to climate change and feeling like I needed to write about it. But I became a mom of twins in 2016, and one of the things that I wrote a little bit about in the book was what a long and circuitous and somewhat unconventional journey that was in the first place. It was not an easy journey for us to get pregnant, and the pregnancy was not easy. So I kind of, landed on the doorstep of motherhood pretty exhausted, having gone through a fair amount of heartbreak and grief and loss just to even get to being a parent in the first place. And I'd been coaching for, I think, about five years before the kids were born. But we went through infertility and pregnancy loss, and I shifted my coaching practice after the twins were born to focus on supporting people who were navigating really complicated and difficult fertility journeys, like I had, my husband and I had. And so in 2016, like, I was kind of beginning to immerse myself in other parents and parents to be, would-be parents, stories of bereavement, grief, loss, sort of this feeling of like parenthood and the journey to parenthood really not going according to plan. In our experience. And I was, sort of intentionally welcoming in, the stories of other people who were going through, just parenthood. This is not going how I thought it was going to go, kind of feeling. And around 2017, parenthood with any young baby is a lot. With twins, it's an extra lot, or with two kids of different.
Can't even imagine.
I can only look back and laugh because I have no idea how anybody does that. Like, you just kind of get through it. You're in survival.
Yeah, sure.
Forget it. Like, I don't even remember what happened. I have pictures. I was there, but I don't remember any of the first year of motherhood other than that. But in 2017, I've always been someone who reads the news and like tries to pay attention to the news. Like, especially with what was going on politically in the US at that time, with the 2016 election being, something that I felt acutely And so I started noticing more and more climate headlines in the news. Like it was just on my radar in a way that was kind of like um, just getting to me. Like I didn't really feel at that time like I had the capacity to do much about it. Like I was working full time, you know, trying to stay married, like dealing with two young kids, like trying to maintain friendships and like some, you know, trying to maintain my own mental health. Like life was just a lot, you know, as it was. But then there was this sort of growing awareness like, wow, this climate change thing is really, it's looking pretty bad, you know. And so I kind of like just filed it away of like, okay, this is bad and I just don't have capacity for it right now. But the next year in 2018, there was kind of a series of events that happened in a pretty short amount of time that really forced me to take it out of that I'll deal with this later file. My grandmother, I'm in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm in the middle of North Carolina where we have always gotten hurricanes. And my mom is from coastal North Carolina. My grandmother lived all of her life in coastal North Carolina, which is frontline community for hurricanes. And so Wilmington, North Carolina has always been kind of my home away from home. And it's a frontline community for hurricanes on the East Coast. And my grandmother died in 2018. She was 97 years old. So she had had a long life, but it was a real it was a real loss for me. Her house was torn down. And of course that had nothing to do with climate change, but for me, sort of like this realizing that I couldn't just go down to Wilmington and see her house anymore was like a big like loss of place.
Sure.
The first time I'd really experienced a sense of like loss of place. And gosh, within a few weeks after her funeral in August 2018, her funeral was in August, Hurricane Florence hit the North Carolina coast. And it was a major hurricane, it made the national news. And I just remember, you know, seeing pictures on the national news of like the cemetery where we had just buried her, like,
Yeah.
you know, of like flooding and trees down. And, you know, by that point, like I sort of knew enough to know this was the new normal, like this is not getting better. You know, flooding in Wilmington is getting worse, even sort of during day to day, like, you know, not even just during hurricanes. So I was feeling this grief about like, wow, like what does this mean for the North Carolina coast? And then a few weeks after that, the 2018 IPCC report came out. So we've just had the 2021 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which I think has been sort of a pivotal moment for a lot of people this year. And it was for me in 2018 of like, wow, there's a ticking clock here.
Sure.
And I remember that report saying, I think it was like there's 12 years left basically to fix this before things get really, really, really bad. And, you know, there I am with two-year-olds thinking like 12 years left, like that's their child, that's it, there's their whole childhood.
Childhood, right.
And so I couldn't, like, you know, climate change had been taken out of this, like deal with it later when the kids get older, when my capacity returns someday, like I'll deal with it later. I realized like there's no later. Like we don't get to like delay this timeline. This is the timeline. You know,
urgent.
this is the time, right? This is
Yeah.
like, this is not something that I get to decide to postpone when I feel like I have the energy to deal with it. And what I found at the time, like my sort of default response to grief is to go like to make things very intellectual. So like I'm the kind of person, I get sad, I just like buy a ton of books about something and like try to learn as much as I can. So I'm like just like taking in all of the information that I can about climate change to try to like put it in an intellectual form that I could deal with. Because that's sort of my first defense for dealing with painful things, is to process it cognitively.
Sure.
But what I found in sort of that process was I really found I had a hard time finding anybody speaking to the experience of mothering small kids and dealing with this. Like there were, I think, 2 books at that time on climate change and parenting, both written by, you know, women whose work I deeply respect. But their kids were much older and they had come to this awareness at a very different place lives in a very different place in the climate crisis, right? And so I couldn't find, doesn't mean it wasn't out there, but I could not find anybody speaking to the experience of the emotional experience of realizing that you don't get to delay participating in this crisis while you're during like the most care intensive years of your kid's childhood. And I felt really isolated and
Yeah.
like, holy shit, like nobody's talking about this. And I remember like even trying to talk about it in some of my local moms groups, and it would just be like just dropping this thing on the floor and like hearing the reverberations of the thud, it was so awkward because nobody else wanted to talk about it, but it seemed like at that moment in time. And I think that's changing.
Good.
Um,
Good.
but at that moment in time, I was like, I don't know who to turn to about this because I feel terrified. I feel like even as I was trying to start to join like some of the climate groups, many of the people in those groups were retired or much further on in their careers, or their kids were older and they were motivated by a love for their kids, but not like changing diapers and not like breastfeeding or chest feeding and not like doing all of these extremely like, energy and care intensive
Yeah.
tasks on a daily basis. So I think that, and starting to hear more and more anxiety from my clients,
Sure.
about climate anxiety as well, because I think many of the clients that I was working with were having, repeated miscarriages, and or having to go through complicated fertility treatments to get pregnant. And, every time a round of IVF fails, like that's a moment where you kind of think like, do I really want to do this? Like, can I really go through this again? And hearing like climate anxiety sort of come up in those moments of like, is this even the right thing
As
to do?
part of that decision-making process. Yeah.
It was really alarming. It was very alarming, and I didn't know what resources to offer them. What do I offer my clients? Like nobody seems to be talking about this very directly. And again, I do think that is changing now. But that was kind of what made me feel like I have to try to offer something, because like I know I need help. I can't be the only one, right? And so I think that's the long version of what inspired me
Yeah.
to write the book.
And I think you're right. I think those stages when you have really young children. I mean, both of my oldest is about to turn 8 and yours are both 5. Is that right?
Mhm.
And these are like, I feel like I'm just coming out of the most
Right.
intensive. I mean, my youngest is still 4, but those most intensive, well, I don't know, maybe it gets more intensive, but those intensive
Right.
years of early childhood, right? And it's only been in the last year and a half that I feel like and I have any capacity to do anything
Neat.
extra above just getting us through the day.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I think you're right. There's this really interesting intersection between that reality and then this reality that says you actually have to deal with this now at the same time that you're dealing with that.
What a clusterfuck.
Yes. Well, and then if you want to throw in a global pandemic and a really under-resourced parents overall and families overall, like let's just do that too.
Right. Yeah. One big
Yeah.
clusterfuck.
One big cluster. Well, so tell me more, like what is unique about looking at the climate crisis as a parent? What challenges do we face uniquely because we're parenting small kids? And maybe also what opportunities do we have that might not be accessible to people who aren't parenting or who aren't parenting young kids?
They're great questions. I think I would say that I feel as a mother, as a parent, I feel some responsibility for the well-being of my children. Like I think that's sort of a fundamental part of responsible parenting for any parent
Sure.
who wants their kid to be well, to be
Yes.
healthy and to be safe. And we kind of, I think, we are socialized to think about the future in certain ways. Like, many of us like might think, okay, maybe our kids might want to go to college someday. Like if there's any extra money, maybe we think we should start a college fund, right? Like ours is very small, but like, it's something that like it has always been in our awareness of like, oh yeah, that's the thing that we should plan for.
Yeah.
Right. Or we think about safety in different ways, right? Like we buy car seats that we think are safe. We try to buy safe cars and like make sure there's, fire extinguishers and smoke alarms in our houses. Like, I think we have these sort of the ways in which we're socialized to think about our kids' well-being and safety. Like most of the parents I know are doing those things, or at least aiming to, right? And so when you throw in something like climate change is a threat to our kids' health and well-being in a major way. Like there's more and more reports coming out from major medical journals detailing sort of the global threat that climate change presents to children's health, both now, particularly in certain parts of the world, and like in the global south, or certain parts of the US, right? Like wildfire or hurricane prone places. There's climate change is a direct threat to kids' well-being. And our kids will live with the consequences of what we do or don't do in the next decade for many more decades than we will. And future children will live with those consequences for many more decades than we will, right? So I think parents in that very basic, like responsible for our kids' safety level, like it's a threat that we have to like integrate into our safety planning and thinking for our kids. So that's one layer of it. I think a more complex layer of it that I have hoped to try to speak to in the book too is like that we are also like the world is changing, whether we like it or not. And that is a really painful reality that even catches my, even I've been kind of immersed in this for a few years now, and it still takes my breath away sometimes. This realization that like life is not going to go back to the normal that was our childhood's normal, right? Like that version of normal is in the past.
We're really at this place where the future that we are expecting for our children has really nothing to do with what the one we might have planned for when we decided to have children.
Right. Yes. So we as parents have to, it's so complex. We have to prepare our kids to live in the world. Like it has always been our job as parents to like try to prepare our kids to be emotionally healthy, wise.
Yeah.
And now the world
we don't know what that world is we're preparing them for, really.
No, well, we can anticipate that it's going to require, I think like the pandemic has really been like, oh, this is kind of a preview. And I think it is in many ways of like that. I think the world that our kids are inheriting is a world where there's going to be a lot more trauma, trauma from natural disasters. There's a lot of other things that climate change may change socially, especially, in all parts of the world, but certain parts of the world are going to get hit worse than others. But I think globally, there's going to be more trauma, potentially, the systems that we depend on now may not hold up, into the future. We need new systems probably for things like food and, some of these basic systems are going to have to adapt, and how we get our energy, right? And so I think, I felt as a parent that, wow, it's really like promoting a sense of like emotional resilience in my kids is like, it's got to be a number one parenting priority. And like, you were the one who introduced me to hand-in-hand parenting, which I think is an incredible tool.
Great resource. Yeah.
For that.
Hard work, but great resource.
But, thinking about things like, growing your own food may be a more useful skill than algebra. Not that my 5-year-olds are learning algebra, right? But like the way our whole educational system, and I am a fan of public schools, in terms of, for a lot of reasons, but I don't think our public school curriculum is anywhere near where it needs to be to prepare kids for, living in the kind of future that seems to be coming. And so parents not only have to sort of have this fundamental responsibility for our kids' safety, but also like the work of shaping good humans, good, wise, healthy humans, like that work that is so undervalued that none of us get paid for, that society doesn't really support. Like that is actually part of how our job as climate aware parents too. And that's a responsibility, say that, a person who doesn't have kids isn't having to show up for on a
Mm,
daily basis, or someone who's parenting, you know, parenting intensive years are over, right? Someone in their 60s might have kids who are grown up. They're not actively in that phase of like trying to teach your kids how to respond to difficult moments, or modeling for them what grief looks like, or, you know, how to
yeah,
manage the sort of day-to-day ups and downs. Like it's a lot of work to do that under any circumstances, but it's really important. So
absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking about this summer and figuring out how to frame this fire that was literally a mile from our house for my children in a way that had them, that was honest
right,
and real, but
right.
didn't
Yeah.
create undue stress and trauma, but the appropriate level of anxiety was also honored. You know, that is very complex parenting.
Oh yeah. Also training for that, right? Like where do you sign up for the class on,
Right.
you know, like how to talk to your kids about, I mean, I think more and more there are resources like that available. It's emotionally intensive for us too, because we're having to sort of pass along these messages to our kids, like figuring out how to frame a wildfire or a hurricane, just as we're figuring out how to frame the wildfire or hurricane for ourselves, right? So
Yeah.
that's intense emotional work that, you know, and adding the having to care for kids, part of it is again like that's a whole other layer of things on the mental load, especially for moms. Like, because let's be honest, like it's mostly mothers who are the ones carrying the load of how do we shape emotionally healthy kids. Not to diminish the contribution of dads, but in most of the households that I know, or non-binary parents, it's mothers who are doing that work, or the bulk of that work.
Yeah.
Um, it's a lot. So,
It has a lot. Yeah. And so I want to be aware too that I mean, this is like heavy stuff. It's not easy to acknowledge all of these pieces. One of the things I really appreciate about your book, there are many things I appreciate. Two of the things that I want to talk about right now. First is that you really make space for the emotions of looking at all of this. You make room for the grief, for the anger, for the anxiety, and in many cases, like give us language to talk about it, which I think is really important. But then I also just appreciate the overall way you framed the book. So you have this sort of three-part framework of pain, possibility, and practice. So we've talked a little bit about the pain, and if you want to talk more about some of the pieces in terms of, you know, where health and climate intersect, and do you feel like there's more to add there that people need to be aware of?
yeah, I mean, I could, yeah, I could go on a little bit of a tangent there, if that's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
I want to make sure we get all the pain
oh, there's so much.
before we move into the other piece, because it is important
Yeah,
that, because I think one of the things that we as humans, and I will say probably as humans who hold a little bit more privilege, so, you know, white, cisgender, like I know that in my life I've had the privilege of shying away from facing some of these harder realities. And what I'm recognizing is that part of this future as individuals, as parents, is building the capacity and the resiliency to actually be with what's hard and what's not working and what is traumatic. So I think that it's important to name all of those hard pieces before we get into the work of what's possible and how do we get there.
yeah, absolutely. And you know, the privilege piece, of course, intersects with health, but I think to speak to the privilege piece a little bit more, I think, you know, one of the there was an article that I referenced early on in the book. I think it's called "The Unbearable Whiteness of Climate Anxiety," written by a woman named Sarah Jaquette Ray, who I love. She wrote a book about climate anxiety aimed at like college age students that I really loved. And she kind of makes the point that, you know, many, you know, it's for those of us who are white and North American, like this sort of experience of like existential crisis is pretty new,
Hmm.
but it's not new for,
Yeah.
you know, many oppressed and marginalized communities. It's not new for parts of the global south that have been sort of actively trying to raise the alarm about the climate crisis for many more years than you or I have been aware of it. And I think like one of the most heartbreaking things of this, these people who are already burdened by oppression, systemic oppression, racism, just the geographic inequities of climate change, like, are gonna continue to get hit worse, right?
Mhm.
um and that applies to children too. I mean, like, on the,
Yeah.
you know children under 5 are predicted to be the population globally hit hurt worst by climate change. And a lot of that's going to be in places like sub-Saharan Africa because of water and food shortages, right? Like, malnutrition is a leading cause of death among very young children in those parts of the world. Conflict, migration, of course, that's going to hit
Yeah.
areas that are already beginning to migrate, right? Like, the Haitian migrants story that's been on the news the last few days. Like, the first thing I thought about that was like, climate change is only going to make this worse. You know what I mean? Like, and it's heartbreaking to me that we're not welcoming, not that those were specifically climate refugees, but like, that's what we're going to be seeing more and
Mhm.
more of that. Like,
Yes.
we're people who have already been hit so hard by climate crisis and all of the many factors that go along with that. Like, one of the major threats for kids' health, that I know you were experiencing this summer, is air pollution,
Mhm.
right? And I have other friends in California who had to evacuate from fires in that area. Air pollution is especially bad for young kids because they, pound for pound, take in more pollution with every breath they take in, right? And they're
Yeah.
still developing, and their brains and their immune systems are still developing. And it's, I think one of the things that I tried to speak to in the book is sort of my experience of parenting kids who were born prematurely. And not that in our case, I don't believe necessarily that climate change was why my twins were born prematurely. Like, it's common with twins for premature birth to happen. Um, but there are long-term consequences for that too, right? Like, my son has sensory processing disorder,
Mhm.
and that's, research suggests that premature birth is a risk factor for sensory processing disorder and several of the other diagnoses that, are probably thrown in there too. And parenting a kid who is wired to be more sensitive, probably to the factors that have been, due to his low birth weight and not being fully developed when he was born, um, that's a long-term challenge, right? That's not
Yeah.
like, the challenge of a premature birth is not over once you get the kid out of the NICU, right? It's like,
Right.
it's years of things being harder than it would have been otherwise. And air pollution and heat waves are linked to premature birth, right? And so
Yeah.
all of I think there hasn't been quite enough attention paid to sort of these long-term parenting consequences
Mhm.
of, you know, yeah, I mean, premature birth is one of the biggest ones, right? And it's harder to parent a kid who's got special needs
Sure.
because of that, right? And so there's going to be more of that, right? And
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I know I love that you're highlighting too that it's not just these one-off events, but that we're going to be seeing sort of long-term chronic symptoms that, yeah, that we're dealing with throughout our children's lives.
right, right. And I'm not hearing enough people talk about that sort of like, what's the long term impact of that, right? Like, I have another dear friend who had to evacuate from the Lake Tahoe fire. She's pregnant, she's got a 2-year-old, right? The air quality there was like 850,
Yeah.
just unbelievably high. Like, I hope and pray that she has nothing but healthy outcomes, but many people in her situation will have adverse outcomes because of the wildfire smoke, and the consequences of that are lifelong in some cases, or at least many years, and yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. Um, I'm like, I'll be honest, there's a part of me that's still, even though I've read your book, I know this stuff. I'm like, reintegrating it and trying to digest it in real time. It is heavy. It weighs heavy.
Mhm.
Let So we've talked a little bit about that intersection of climate change and health, the unique threats that children especially are going to face. What what are the skills that we need as parents to support ourselves through the coming years, but also to support resilient, healthy, proactive children
Yes.
um
Yeah.
in the coming years,
I think that's such a great place to focus because, you know, if you spend too much time in I mean, we do have to face the grief, right? I think that is actually one of the number one skills I would say is like grieving, right? Like grief
Mhm.
is a skill, like can be practiced, right? Nobody wants to. I don't want to, but like it, and I think like I had some practice with it, both with our own journey through pregnancy and loss and practice and holding space for other parents who had stillbirths or miscarriages or multiple failed rounds of IVF. Like the skill of grieving is actually what can allow you to move forward, not
Mm,
on. Like there's no moving on from a terrible loss. Like I think that's a misconception. Like we're not going to move on from climate change. Nobody
right.
moves on from a stillbirth, but
Not
you
like
can
a stone we step over.
no, but there with time and capacity building, you can gradually hold space for other things too, right? Like I'm thinking, like for example, this is a hard example, but like if you have a miscarriage or a stillbirth, right? Like you never get over that, but in time, like you can grow your capacity to think maybe I'll try again, or maybe it's safe to feel joy here where that didn't feel possible before. The pain doesn't dissolve. I think that's a misconception with grief.
Build your capacity to hold it and
Yeah, you just build your capacity to hold it, right? And so I think there's this idea of grief literacy that I learned about from a group called Being Here Human, and I really like that phrase, which I think is their phrase. But just sort of like growing our capacity to feel grief and also make room for other things at the same time is one of the key skills, because the grief is going to keep coming, right? I think the losses are going to keep coming. Um, and the more skilled we are at holding space for grief, I think the more we can remember that that's not the entire story.
Mhm.
Because when you're in the midst of a loss, it can sometimes, at least for me, like feel like this is the entire world. Like this is
Okay.
never going to end. This is all I will ever experience. There will never be joy again. And I don't think that's true. Um, although it does feel like it's true. But practicing grief can help us to practice remembering that the loss is not the whole story, and
Mm.
it never is. So that's one piece of things. And unfortunately it's not like you can't ever just like check that off the list, like, okay, did that.
Right.
Master
Check.
degree, so there we go. As much as
Yeah.
certain personalities like mine would like to have a very clean to-do list completed. um I think another skill is community,
Mm.
and I know that's been really hard lately, with the pandemic making us all, I think, feel more isolated, in our local spaces. But we're going to need people, in order to survive the climate crisis, both like in this very practical sense of, if there's a wildfire or a hurricane, excuse me, your neighbors are probably going to be the ones to help you. Um,
Yeah.
but also just to feel that sense of not being alone
Mm.
in the difficult emotions, like having people that you can talk to um, on that front is really important as well. Um, I think a sense of creativity and imagination is really important as well. I think most of the framing around climate change, I'm gonna drink of water here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, and as you're taking the drink, I will say that um, I think one of the hopeful things about coming out of the pandemic and also coming out of some of these recent headlines is that I do think in general, people are talking more about hard things. And
Totally.
so that sense of feeling isolated or crazy, or that experience you had in the moms group where people were like, wait, what? You're worried about climate change? Like, I just wanted to talk about like which diaper cream is working for you, you know? My hope is anyway, that that will be happening less and less, and that there'll be more bridges to building that community on this side of catastrophe, right? There's like the community that you need in healing from a difficult, you know, like a climate disaster or some sort of weather disaster. But then there's the community you need just in sort of processing what's going on and how you're experiencing it.
Yeah, I mean, community is needed all the way around. I would say, like, for me, one of the thing that has made it possible for me to go from climate despair to climate engagement successfully is finding other people who cared to talk to you about it. Like, that's like the single thing that has made the most difference for me. And once I started plugging into other people who cared about it, I realized, like, hey, I'm not alone in caring, and other people are working on this. Like, people all over the world are actually working on this, right? So that increased my sense of hopefulness, because this very sort of narrow set of blinders that I have of like, oh my God, nobody's talking about it, nobody's thinking about it, nobody's working on this one, for like, oh wow, there's tons of people thinking, talking and working on it.
I just feel like even just hearing that, I'm like, oh, right. It's really bad. And, you know,
and is important.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there was Joanna Macy is an amazing sort of philosopher, writer, activist, and she came up with this framework called the 3 stories of our time. And I referenced that in the book, and she's yeah, like business as usual, which is kind of like this, like, no, climate change isn't happening, sort of like, no need to worry about it, you know, climate deniers, or like, just like keep on marching with capitalism as, as though it can last forever. That kind of mindset is one. And then another mindset is the great unraveling, is what she calls it, which is like, oh my gosh, the world is ending, it's all falling apart, and we're going to hell, and it's hopeless. And then the 3rd story of her time is something that she frames as the great turning, which I love so much. And it's a skill in and of itself. It's like remembering the and, right? It's like remembering that, you know, yes, things are bad. It's not glossing over that in any kind of Pollyanna way, but it's like, yes, things are bad, and people are working on this. Like, people are waking up and rising up all over the world. There are solutions. It's the remembering the and that makes a form of hope. Some people would call it active hope or stubborn optimism, or some of the phrases that have been used to describe the sense of like really not hope in the Pollyanna sense of like, oh, it'll just magically go away and get better.
Bypassing.
Yeah, not bypassing, but the hope that comes from like, people are working on this, and I'm going to work on this. Like, I'm going to engage in solutions too. Like, I'm no longer going to just let business as usual or the great unraveling be the whole story in my life. I'm actually going to become a part of the solution as well. Like, that gives us hope too. I think the more that we engage, the more we feel like empowered and a sense of self-efficacy.
I've certainly felt that in my own life, just even if it's a really small thing, and I feel like it's not even the most I could be doing, just by doing something, I feel like at least I am putting my energy in the direction I want this ship to turn. Yes. You know. Yeah. And along those lines, actually, one of the things you interviewed me in the process of writing this book, and one of the things that we talked about in our interview, but that also came up in the book as a larger theme, was this piece around parents like you and I having a hard time identifying ourselves as activists or understanding how activism or any sense of advocacy might fit in to our lives when we're busy parenting. You know, I know for me, I felt like, because having been pretty engaged and active in my college years, it felt hard to see any sort of value in what I could offer when I was at home, compromising my values by buying paper diapers for my second child.
Yeah.
And at that point, it's really easy to check out of the whole game and just be like, well, I'm losing, right?
Yeah.
I'm not doing enough. I've backtracked on my values. I'm making compromises. I might as now what? So I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about that and
Yeah.
just, what do you think about all of that?
I think it's been, the word activist, I realized pretty early on in the process of writing this book, because I did interview several people in my life, just kind of sense where are you with this word? What is this meaning to you? And I found that as much as I have always liked the word, although I haven't always felt like I deserved the word, put it that way, a lot of people didn't seem to like it, or even if they did like it, couldn't claim it for themselves, because I think there's so many stereotypes. If you did a Google search on the word activist, you would see Greta Thunberg with a protest sign at a march.
Right.
You would see marches, protests, things that.
It's a very specific image that I have in my mind.
And it's often, I think, a very aggressive image. I in some of the the feedback I got from people who didn't like the word activist, had negative connotation that meant sort of attacking people with your views, basically. And even though I don't have that feeling about it personally, that was something that came up commonly. And like you, I was also someone who was very much an activist in college in ways that were more aligned with that sort of stereotype of what activism means. And yet, as a grown up with other small humans to take care of, that felt pretty inaccessible. And like you, I realized if you can't see yourself within an identity, if I am someone participating in the change making process, it's easy to just check out and say, well, I just can't, and then to just remove yourself entirely. And I think where, my health coach background kind of came in with this is that I, am trained in a model of coaching that is all about the behavior change process, right? What does it take to move from I want something in my life, or I want to make a change, to actually doing it, right? And knowing that you should do something is almost never enough to cross that, right? All of us have so many things that we know we should be doing, and what it actually takes to cross that bridge, I think, has been one of the things that's been missing from the environmental movement and the climate movement, is that people know in general, I think, what would help.
Yeah.
We all know by now that we should probably reduce our carbon footprints. We all know that we should probably be trying to stop big oil, which sounds incredibly overwhelming. All of these things that it's not to say that more information is not useful there, because I think it is. But the changes that most of us could make immediately, we already know what those are in general. But it's
we'll get this little buzz of urgency around it, and oh yeah, this matters, this is important, I should be doing something. And then it's very, unless you have that next piece, it's very quick for that to fizzle out.
Totally.
Or become overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I've experienced that so many times.
Yeah.
There's there's a framework by a guy named James Clear, who wrote the book Atomic Habits, and he talks about this idea of identity-based habits, right? In order to achieve a goal, which might be to run a marathon or to participate in the climate movement in some way. It doesn't really matter what the goal is, but you have to fundamentally believe that you're the kind of person who can do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so the way to cross that bridge is to begin to sort of have small wins that move you in the direction of believing oh, I can do this, right? And so I think for parents, we actually need to broaden, for everybody probably, but especially for parents whose energetic capacity is so limited by what parenting requires of us on a daily basis, if we can't broaden the idea of what activism means, then we'll never be able to participate. And I think we really need to, like for me, like the thing that helped me to start to see myself as an activist again was like writing postcards to voters.
Yes.
And that was such a simple, like one postcard at a time. Like it seems so insignificant, but it was something that I could do like while my kids were there. I could be interrupted a million times. I could do it while watching The Bachelor, like, and drinking
Yes.
beer at night. You know what I mean? Like it was something that did not require me to
Mm,
be anywhere at a specific time, or didn't require like focused didn't require too much brain power.
yeah.
And it felt like tangible. And eventually my kids sort of like would put the stamps on because they thought it was like stickers. So
My kids
that
are doing
little,
that too.
I mean, it seemed small, but like over time, like that was like, it became a thing, and we ended up writing hundreds. Like we do it every election now. And
Yeah.
gradually, like that gave me the confidence to start working the elections in my local
Mm.
area. Now I work the elections as a precinct official, right? Which again was just the small win was like, let me just find out more information. Okay, maybe this seems more doable than I thought it would. So it's broadening our sense of like what counts enough that we can find those little ends, and over time.
And I just love this so much because I do think that's been the biggest shift for me since becoming a parent is I've really had to redefine what change looks like and what progress looks like. And everything is much more micro. It's like the reality is I have these little micro opportunities in my day. Um, and so figuring out how to use those micro opportunities in a way that's aligned with values, aligned with this bigger picture that I want to be a part of, it's the only way it works, really.
Yeah, I think there's a lot, and this is probably a controversial thing to say, and I even have mixed feelings about it myself. But like, I think there's rightfully so a lot of like pressure, if you will, in the climate movement to figure out like what are the most effective actions, like
Mm,
your carbon footprint, and do those, right? Like quit flying, stop driving, plant-based diet, and I would advocate for all of those things. In our family, plant-based diet was easy. We've always been plant-based. So that did not feel overwhelming to me. I hate flying, not a big deal. The idea of like giving up our car, like how do you do that when you're a parent of small kids? Like how
yeah.
in many parts of the country, like how do you get them? How do you get groceries? How do you
Well, and our
like
cities aren't set up for that. And
right,
a lot,
the infrastructure
right.
isn't there. And so if I thought that was the only way I could be a good climate activist was to give up my car,
Yeah.
I would be like, okay, I can't do that. I don't know how to function in this other responsibility as a parent. Like maybe I could figure that out if I didn't have kids, but like to add that whole other layer of like having to figure out how to get everybody's needs met,
Absolutely.
having to get to work.
Well, and as soon as you try to think about figuring that out,
Yeah,
you're like, I'm out. I give up.
yeah, which, I mean, for me, it's like it doesn't mean I might like I am gradually thinking about like how do we drive less, right? Like
Yes.
because and of
Right.
course the pandemic has helped, but like if I let that be my benchmark of whether or not I'm able to engage in the first place or doing a good enough job, I'll never succeed, and I'll never have the efficacy to do what I could do. And so I think all of the checklists that you see about like the carbon footprint, they do matter, but I think what matters more on a practical level is like finding your in, which will
Mhm.
be different than mine and different than your neighbors and different than your sisters, like, and seeing that as training rather than a means to, like, I see it as like we're practicing for a long game. We are training for a marathon. It's not that, the 5K of writing postcards to voters is great,
Yeah.
and we're all in a marathon.
Well, yeah, and I think that's an important point too, because I think there's the sort of shadow side of this where you're like, oh, I'm doing my part. I'm writing the postcards. I'm sending $10 a month to this place. And then you don't allow yourself to challenge yourself, to get uncomfortable and bring in the next layer of what's being required of you.
Absolutely. And I think, right, which yeah, maybe is where some of that pressure comes from of like, here are the top 3 things, you must do these because these are the things that are going to have the biggest impact. Yes, absolutely. We have to think about it as like, this is practice. Like if you, and like starting where
It's
you are is
training. It's like building the muscles to do the
right,
next scarier thing.
right.
Hopefully.
Like think about the marathon goal, right? Like no, and keep that end goal in mind, but know that you can't run the 26 miles. Not that I've ever run 26 miles. I'm never going to run a marathon.
I'm not a runner at all. So
Marathoner, so this metaphor comes to mind to me, but yeah, nobody runs that out the gate,
right.
right? Like, and there's injuries and setbacks, right? Like it's a process, like to, some races you drop out of, but then you try again. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'm aware of the time here, and I guess the last question I want to make sure we sort of talk about is first of all, I hope that everyone watching this will go and buy your book. So we can talk about at the end about where they find it and how they do that. But for folks who have read your book, what is it you want them to go do in the world? Like, what do you hope that parents engage after reading this book? Or what actions do you hope they take?
it's a great question. I think I have many hopes, but I think the number one hope I would have is that people who read the book could, if they don't already have a climate community, could find one. And that might be joining a group. It might be, getting a few friends together for a book club. But I think to do any of this work, we need other people, right? I needed other people to do anything, right? Like, and so in order to stay in the marathon for the long run, you need training partners. So I think the number one thing to stay motivated and engaged and supported is to like find some group of other people that you can talk to about climate change and both express sort of the painful feelings and share that, but also share, here's what I'm doing, and inspire each other and talk about solutions, right? Like I keep coming back to this phrase, like parenting, in a changing climate is just hard, right? And we can't do this alone.
Right.
So don't try to do it alone. Like find other people.
Find people. Yeah.
And I think I would also hope that like people would take away a sense of, if they don't already see themselves as an activist, would see maybe a sense of like, maybe I could be an activist, right? Because I think that all parents should be climate activists. Again, people may have different interpretation of that, what that word means. But I think that it is part of our responsibility, as parents, especially parents of privilege, to be actively engaged. And so I would hope that people can start to see themselves as activists and like find their foot in the door, if that feels out of reach right now. Like it doesn't, you don't become an activist overnight, right? It's a behavior change process. It's an identity shift process if you're not already there. But yeah, I think those are the two, like if I had to sort of really like narrow it down, it's like find your people and like start to think of yourself as a climate activist and what does that mean for who you are.
I love that. Do you have any like foot in the door sort of activities? You mentioned the postcards to voters. Are there any others that you feel are like a nice entry level?
Yes. So here's like the entry level ones I would prescribe.
Sure.
And watching may already be doing these, but like I one of the groups that I'm looped into is Citizens Climate Lobby, and I have joined their campaign team, which sounds more involved than it actually is, to call our North Carolina senators, on a regular basis. So every few weeks, I get a text message and an email that says, it's your day to call, with a template that tells me exactly what I need to say. Or if I'm feeling like overwhelmed and I just want to email, I could email, right? And it has the email already written out for me. You could personalize it a little bit. And I've got my all of my representatives' numbers are programmed as contacts in my phone.
I love that you did. I did that since you told me that you did that. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, and and this is like, if you're really low energy, call during off hours, leave a voicemail. If you don't want to talk to a human, like just leave a voicemail. It will still count. Like I've made it a habit to call, my kids are old enough that I can do this safely, but I call my representatives when they're at the playground. It's just like, we're at the playground. It's okay. It's time to call. And it literally takes all of 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So, but if you're brand new, like having a sort of regular reminder that's coming from someone else with like, here's the message, like it's done for you. It's a really, doable habit that almost anybody I think could engage in.
I love that. They're not specifically climate focused, but the Americans of Conscience checklist is a similar sort of setup. And that's been really helpful for me because I don't have to do a ton of research and think a lot about what I'm saying or who I'm writing to. It's all done for me and it's really helpful.
Right. And the people doing that research are probably not taking care of small kids. Probably, it's my guess. Right. So
yeah.
I mean, so it makes it easy for people like us.
That resourcing. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you. Anything else you want to say before we wrap this up? And of course, we'll tell them where to find you and your book, but anything else you wanted to say about the book or about the topics we've covered today?
Well, first of all, just thank you, because our conversations were such a big part of me testing ideas and like getting, because I, as we've talked about before on this personal level, like I can get stuck in my own head and not not trust that, that other people might be feeling the same way. So thank you for like our conversations and helping me to feel less alone. And I think, if anybody watching this is still feeling alone in your climate despair, you are not alone. We're definitely not alone. There are more and more parents out there who are deeply concerned, and find them and embrace them virtually, if not, actually in real life. And I think we'll get a lot further together in community with this.
Yes. And I really do highly recommend the book. I know that because I got to sort of see from the beginning stages to the end, I might be a little biased, but I don't think so. It's a beautiful book. I love reading about your story. You share a lot of your story in the book. There are incredible tools in the book, and it just, again, I think it does such a beautiful job of both outlining the sort of what's at stake and the urgency of what we're being called to in this time, while also leaving that room for that sense of stubborn optimism, that sense of hope that we have to have, because if we don't have that, we will throw our hands up, we will give up, we will check out of the game, and then there is no hope. So I just really, really appreciate the balance you've struck. I really appreciate having a book that speaks right to my stage of life and to the realities of my life as a parent. There are several stories you share in there that made me laugh out loud because they're so familiar in my life with my children. And it's just a really beautiful book as well. So where can people connect with you and your work, and where can people go find the book?
I'll show, apologies for the blur right here. I am in my closet. So, so I have my blur on.
Is the cover.
Right now, thanks to some COVID related delays, it's end of September as we're recording this. It can only be found at Amazon, unfortunately, because we love small independent booksellers, and we're working our best, my publisher and I, to get it available outside of Amazon. But right now, Amazon is shipping it really fast. So thank you, Amazon, for that. And I'm online mostly at Instagram. So at Elizabeth Bechard is my favorite social media place to hang out. I'm not at all on Facebook or Twitter. And elizabethbechard.com. I occasionally will write a blog post, not very often. So if you want to connect with me online, I'd love to see you on Instagram. So
awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So good to be here with you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Too.